Hey Bob, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How about
Thank
you?
you, blessed Bob, blessed, and thank you so much for making this time for from your busy schedule and making available your presence and insights for us. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to do it.
Great. So, Bob, what got me to reach out to you, though we've been connected on LinkedIn for some time, we've never had any exchange. I read one of your posts, which is about the Cynefin framework by Dave Snowden,
Yep.
and I've been trying to follow Dave's work for quite some time. I can't say that I've understood it completely. I just am a, I think I'm a decent student, and I'm still trying to learn. But when I saw your post, it completely resonated with me, and I thought I should reach out and just jam with you and understand a little more about how did you think through this particular. So just for the benefit of audience, if you can quickly lay the case of how did you think through that, and how did you arrive at the
Yeah.
post that you have?
Yeah. So I wrote a little bit about the Cynefin framework in a book called The Workmanship of Leaders. And I think that, subsequent to, so that got some criticism and so forth. So I ended up writing a fairly lengthy blog post to provide additional explanation. But basically, let's think about what a framework is. It's defined as a set of rules that help people comprehend problems to aid in decision making. And so I studied Cynefin, but could not help but to notice that something seemed to be missing based upon my years of research on leadership and my studies of why leaders resist, reject, or ignore certain types of problems that often result in major failures, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But it basically, the Cynefin framework lacked an element, and just an element, it's a very useful thing, but it lacked an element, in my view, of realism. It just didn't have, it just felt something was missing. And so when you think a little bit more about it, Cynefin reflects the common business-like success orientation. Business is very success-oriented, doesn't like to talk about failures. And that success orientation, um, suggests that leaders want to solve all problems that come to them in some sort of noble way. But the reality is, if you study leadership carefully, they make all kinds of errors. And these errors essentially are a reflection of their status, rights, and privileges that they have, that they can ignore or reject certain problems. And I'm sure many of us have stood up in front of leaders and said this and that is a problem, and they didn't see it that way. They didn't see it as a problem as we did. And so when you think about the problems that leaders ignore, they're real world examples, such as the Boeing 737 MAX disasters, Wells Fargo financial fraud, the British Petroleum, BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, General Motors bankruptcy, in Italy, the Morandi bridge failure, in England, the Grenfell Tower fire, Takata airbags, the Vale mining disaster in Brazil, and many more. So one of the things that I taught for many years was a course called decision failure analysis, where we would look at failures such as what I mentioned and the decision making surrounded it. And of course, the prelude to all of these failures was leaders ignoring the fact that the problem existed. So it seemed to me there need to be another domain added to the Cynefin framework that reflected the reality. Again, it's a set of rules that help people comprehend problems and aid in decision making. Well, sometimes how leaders comprehend problems are such that the decision is it's not a problem. Uh,
Yep,
so that was
yep.
basically how I thought through this. So it's based upon teaching that course for many years on failure analysis of leaders' decisions, and also just the research I've done over the years in studying why leaders resist, reject, ignore the existence of certain problems.
Beautiful, beautiful, Bob. In fact, it reminds me a couple of things. One is, I remember some years back, or maybe just a couple of years back, I was listening to this podcast by the Institute of New Economic Thinking out of New York. It's a multidisciplinary approach to economic thinking. And one of the guests in the podcast was Margaret Heffernan, the author of Willful Blindness, a bestseller called Willful Blindness. And I remember very distinctly they were mentioning that most of the errors could be classified as errors of omission or errors of commission, and those could then be, you could look at what could have been done, or could there be frameworks that satisfy or that help or enable such errors to not occur again. And the other thing that comes to mind as you were speaking is again a video that I saw of Clayton Christensen some years back. Clayton was mentioning that when he began his journey as an academician, he studied a bunch of companies that were successful in 80s and 90s. And he saw that there were these set of leaders who were at the helm, and they were making these choices and strategic moves, and the company would be successful. And it's the same set of leaders a little later, or maybe a few years later, making a set of strategic choices and the company failing drastically. So these couple of things came up for me. Does that resonate with you? Is it? Do you have agreements?
Well, absolutely. And this is what I think is the problem with the Cynefin framework, that it's a leader's framework for decision making. That's how it's understood. And what it neglects is the social, political, economic, and historical, and philosophical and historical contexts that have long shaped leaders' existence, their thinking, their behaviors. That's why I say it lacks an element of realism, because what we have is ways of thinking that go back way back in time to Egypt. Egypt was the first government and civilization to write things down extensively. And you see the same kind of way of thinking then as now. And so this has to be taken into account. Leaders are going to select the closed domain, which means they're going to dismiss the problem whenever the problem context clearly threatens their status, rights, and privileges. So there's a political element. If I'm going to look bad, I'm going to try to ignore the problem. And then if it ends up blowing up on me, I'm going to blame somebody else. So, in a sense, you can say whether the closed domain should be added to the framework or not, and I'm getting pushback that it shouldn't be added to the framework. It's kind of immaterial to the argument that I make, which is that it's only useful to leaders if they agree that certain problems exist. And leaders often face problems that, in their view, they do not exist. And so it's it's also possible a leader's view that a problem exists where none actually exists. A leader can believe there to be a problem where none actually exists, and the Cynefin framework doesn't take that into account. So, so in my view, the Cynefin framework and the related processes, such as now Mr. Snowden has moved on to estuary mapping and so forth, do not take into account the likelihood that the narratives among the actors who are contributing to the discussion of this problem and mapping out things in the estuary map, that these folks are deeply colored by the atomistic thinking and the folk metaphysics, the Newtonian metaphysics, the ontology that pervades the thinking and language of business people.
Right.
And so I just think it's not taking these things into account. And so the framework, its usefulness could be improved by taking these things into account. And that's the basic point that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I love the thing that you mentioned in the post. You mentioned about an interesting way in which you try and put this across. You're saying it's more of a system of profound privilege on the lines of systems of profound knowledge, and it's an interesting thing, and that's where you bring out the political, economic, social forces at play. Even in this conversation, I mean, if you were to bring everything to here and now as we interact here, there would be certain things that I would be interested in, and then there would be certain things that you would be interested in, and those forces could be at play even in this conversation. What do you think would be Dave's best argument against what you're proposing?
Well, what I have said is when you take the culture of leadership, which I call the institution of leadership, it's simply that the culture of leadership, it's a sociological culture, the way leaders, the common ways of thinking that leaders have. And I include within that the system of profound privilege, which reflects the status, rights, and privileges and authority that leaders have. And it needn't be the top leader too, because even if somebody at a lower level first level supervisor has certain status, rights, and privileges as well in their job, and they can choose to ignore problems as well. But Dave's basically saying that the foundation of my argument rests on the institution of leadership and system of profound privilege, which he says does not exist. He doesn't acknowledge the existence of those things. And of course, to deny that is just to deny history. It's well documented in people's lived experiences. So, one of the difficulties with the Cynefin framework is it presupposes that we understand leaders, or presupposes an understanding of leadership. And one of the things that I found that it's been particularly true in my work in the world of lean management is we go in thinking that leaders want lower costs and higher profits and shorter lead times and greater market share and so forth. And it seems apparent if you're running a business, those would be the things the leaders would want. And therefore, they would jump into lean management because it delivers all those things and so many more. And it turns out most leaders aren't interested in lean management because it abridges their status, rights, and privileges. And so this ends up being of an order of importance higher than market share and profits and so forth, because even if you could run a business fairly poorly, you can still be profitable and so on. So we make the assumption that we understand how leaders think and what they want and how they function socially and what they're concerned about socially and so forth. And those assumptions are mostly wrong. And that's why to me, the Cynefin framework came across as just lacking some very important elements.
Right. Couple of things coming up for me, Bob, as you share this. One is I remember coming across an interesting way in which the current economy could be caricatured as an intangible economy, or the rise of the weightless economy. In words of economist Samuel Bowles, where he's saying that more and more people are now engaged in kind of producing work that is not tangible, in the sense you can't touch and feel. They're not driven by motor functions. They're largely driven by conversations and opinions and judgments and cognitive thing. Do you see in your experience, do you see that this intangible economy that we are drafted in now has more challenges and intersubjectivity involved that makes it even more vexing, the problem that you're citing? Do you see that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in an information economy, information is subject to all kinds of corruption and coloring in certain way. And everybody's ontology seems to, their metaphysical foundation that describes to them what reality is different. And it's just there's more variations of this, and so it's harder to gain consensus and so forth. So yeah, I think there is an element of that problem going on. No, absolutely. But that relates to, if I'm standing up in front of the president of a company and saying there's a problem, and the president saying, well, doesn't think that's a problem, this is two different metaphysical foundations. And that's what I'm saying. If it's a leader's framework for decision making, metaphysical foundation for the leader is very different than the metaphysical, use the word ontology if you like, foundation for the worker. And so there's a difficult time communicating, as we all know from experience, between a worker, a mid-level manager to the top leader, CEO, or president. There's always some kind of communication gap because the metaphysical foundation is different between these two people.
Yeah. And Just out of curiosity, I'm just trying to think this through a little further. Why would Dave be not seeing this, experienced as he is, and having worked in so many different areas? Why does this not occur to him as a key factor that he cannot not have, or he cannot see that that's a big issue? I'm just wondering, why would that be the case?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. And
Okay.
I can't speculate. The only thing he said is that he doesn't agree with the existence of the institution of leadership and system of profound privilege. And of course, this is just a name that I gave to the culture of leadership and the sort of operating parameters of leadership that a lot of it is based upon status, rights, privileges, and so forth, that I call the system of profound privilege. And that was just a play on words to Deming's system of profound knowledge. So that's all that was. But if you
Right.
deny their existence, then uh, um, it's again denying reality that we all see in our interactions with leaders, and that's well documented in these kinds of disasters like the Boeing 737 Max and Grenfell Tower fires and so forth. Lower level people went to leaders and says, "Here's the problem. We have a problem," and the leader said, "No, budget, time, schedule. We got to meet these things. Just keep doing it." And you have these disasters that people die as a result of these things. These are not like simple problems like, the computer mouse doesn't work. These are major death and injury, things happening.
Right.
And so I think it's obvious, but not everybody sees it that way, apparently.
Yeah. If I were to just invoke another thinker here, Bob, Francis Fukuyama, a public intellectual, who's written extensively about a lot of things, especially in the last decade, his publishing of books around political order and political decay, where he's trying to document 2,000 years of different kinds of civilization. And he's actually trying to bring forth the double-edged sword of bureaucracy. While it gives some kind of a chain of command or chain of workflow, it also can work counterproductively if it is not if there is nothing called as meta bureaucracy, and sort of thing. So I'm just wondering that if we look at the management landscape and leadership landscape, there are hundreds of books written on management and leadership and
Yeah.
strategy. A simple search on Amazon could give us 50,000 results in each of these
Oh, yeah.
categories.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm wondering that most of these frameworks have been around for some time, and a lot of consultants and certification companies and even sincere people wanting to make changes have tried these frameworks. Uh, are there any frameworks to solve for the issue at hand that you bring forth, which is obvious also? Or do you think it's inherently insolvable or wicked enough, and hence people are just trying to choose battles that they can fight rather than battles that are difficult? What do you think?
Yeah. Doing what needs to be done versus doing what's easy to be done. Yeah. No, I mean, it's solvable, and we see examples of this there's an American television show called Undercover Boss, where the CEO works as in the store, CEO of the big company that's a chain of sandwich shops, works in the store making a sandwich to learn about the problems that these people face. And these people, of course, have been complaining, and they send these problems up the chain of command, and they either stop at the mid-level or they get to the top and these problems are ignored. And then, of course, the leader, when they're actually making the sandwich, is like, "Oh, I had no idea it was so hard to make a sandwich. And I had no idea there were these shortages of materials. And I had no idea of the requirements for disinfecting. And I had no idea of this or that. And it's really hard to make sandwiches when there's a line of hungry people that are, when you're hungry, you get a little bit angry." And so they're hangry. They, hungry and angry, put it together. They're
Right.
hangry and they're impatient, and
Right.
it's a really hard job, and they don't make a lot of money doing this, and they do a really good job. And anyway, So they, the leaders end up going back to their job after a week and making all kinds of policy changes uh, that to improve that the work that these workers have suffered under for, in some cases, decades, not a week or two, but decades. And so, yeah, it's a solvable problem, but you then have this system of profound privileges, and leaders typically will not want to engage the workers. You can think of it, for example, in a simpler way of, you know, I'm the king of the kingdom, and I want to go to war with some other person, king, and defeat them. And I want to do it quickly because they could die at any time from disease. So I need to get a bunch of bows and arrows and cannonballs made to mount my war here against this king. And, if there's problems in the arrow making shop that's affecting their output, it's very unlikely that me as the king is going to go visit that arrow making shop to, you know, to understand the problem and make their job easier to make more arrows. I'm going to instead, yell at somebody below me to get that job done faster. They're going to yell at somebody below them, and so on down the line. And that's typically how it goes in the year 1300 as the year, 2023. So it's solvable, but you have to penetrate the institution of culture associated with the institution of leadership and system of profound privilege, which says it is absolutely the wrong thing to get involved with those workers.
Right. What are some of the constructive criticism that you found to your post, Bob?
Well, predictably, some like the post. The folks who like it didn't say why they liked it. It seems that now this is a very interesting phenomenon. It seems that the people who didn't like it based their comments on the image without reading the accompanying post, because the comments simply suggest that they didn't bother reading the post. They did not address the central argument that I made, that leaders have a different metaphysics than workers, and if it's a leader's framework for decision making, it has to take that into account. There's status, rights, privileges, and so on that others do not have. So one of the criticisms was that that the closed domain should be under the current model, under the confused domain. But what does confused mean? And so if you go to the Cynefin, the Cynefin glossary, it says it's a state of not knowing the type of domain being faced while not necessarily being aware of that. Well, most leaders would not fit that definition of being in the confused domain. They clearly know the ends that they're striving for, either short or long term, or both. They're simply not confused, and it doesn't belong by that Cynefin definition of being that. Another criticism was closed-minded leaders would be the type of people who would think of the solution first and then decide what the kind of problem is. But the closed domain that I proposed doesn't have anything to do with leaders being closed-minded, which typically we would say, if you're closed-minded, you're not willing to consider different ideas or opinion. Instead, it's associated with leader status, rights, and privileges. The leader simply has a different view of reality, which can appear to others as being closed-minded, but it is actually their informed view of the situation as a leader. Again, it goes back to these presumptions that we understand leaders and how they think and so forth, and we come up with these frameworks and models and different systems of management, such as lean management, thinking that of course leaders would want this stuff, and of course leaders would find this stuff very helpful. And as you said, we have 50,000 books in any one of these categories that are designed in some way, shape, or form to help leaders along. And where are we today? Leadership as a field of study has been going on for about 100 years now, and yet we still see predominantly the same kind of leadership that existed in ancient Egypt. And it's not as harsh as it was then and so forth. And it's not physically as harsh, but it can be mentally quite difficult on people
Right.
today. So,
Right.
so I think some of the criticisms are, they're based on not reading the blog posts, so they're not very good, and um, they're not taking into consideration other things.
Right. I'm actually, a couple of things are emerging for me, Bob. One is when you look at the role of a leader, uh, there is this thing called, and I'm not trying to get the military caricature of this, but choose your battles. In a sense, choose your variables that you want to tinker on in terms of the organization or whatever you're working on and taking a strategic call on. You obviously cannot work on all the variables at the same time. You choose your variables. And when you choose those variables, you assume that either they would take care of the unchosen, or the unchosen can be taken care of later, or anyways, we can't do anything about it. Let's just do the best we can here with those chosen variables. Um,
Yep.
uh, so maybe so that could be one of the pushback, or one, not a pushback, but that could be one of the submissions that could come to you. The other
Yep.
submissions that could come to you would be bringing this whole thing to the human nature. Uh, this idea of being able to see the wrong in others or outside much more easily than seeing the wrong in oneself. Um, uh,
Hmm.
could that be also playing in terms of, aside from the political aspect of it, but also the inability to see one's own, some kind of blindness to one's own wrongs,
Yeah.
kind of thing. How would you respond to something like
Well,
these?
oh yeah, I would. So um, when it comes to picking battles, whether you're the king or queen hundreds of years ago, or a CEO today, or even a supervisor, oftentimes, especially if you're high up, the battles will be related to, there'll be financial battles. There'll be battles related to budget and wanting to avoid problems that end up affecting the budget. And so an example is going back to the Boeing 737 MAX. Boeing went into that program in such a way where the goal was to save $10 billion in development costs. And they made various decisions along the line of outsourcing this and doing that and so forth and so on, many of which combined to create the disasters that we know about and the ongoing problem with the door plug falling out of this airplane during flight. Um, uh, and so with the 737 MAX, the idea was to save $10 billion, but they ended up spending $50 billion to clean up the mess. What you often see, and in the failure analysis that we've done like 70 of these in the course that I've taught over the years, is that the decisions made, picking the battles are penny wise, pound foolish. So they're looking to save a little bit, whether it's costs, schedule, something like that, something of a generally financial nature, stock price, something like that. And they'll be penny wise, save a little bit, pound foolish, end up costing them big time later down the road. So picking the battles is normally done in a way that's not thought about the impact on other stakeholders, except perhaps investors, is a main consideration in these picking the battles and the stock price and so forth. And that's how they end up making these huge problems.
Right. And how would you respond to the human nature submission? Uh, what would you say to that?
Well, if you look back in history, I mean, part of human nature has been this idea that if I accumulate wealth, I can live a little bit of an easier life compared to those who don't. And so you see some over the years, the battles that have occurred and the kings of going back to the Neolithic era forward, um, the Neolithic Revolution and so forth forward, that there's been a you know pretty consistent desire to human nature wise to create wealth for oneself, which seems, according archaeologically, seems to not have existed prior to the Neolithic Revolution, where things were more of, I don't what does owning something mean? doesn't mean anything. We use it to survive. If you need it to survive, here, use it. It's not a question of owning things. And of course, if you're happen to be nomadic, owning things just weighs you down, and that doesn't do you any good for survival. So,
Right.
so I think the human nature aspect, enough time has passed and evolution, and it's kind of, baked into our thinking and our economic, our neoclassical, neoliberal economic system, that it's ends up kind of being a human nature problem,
Right.
which is not unsolvable, but it requires a different metaphysical basis, a different understanding of, so in business we would go from the shareholder theory of business to the stakeholder theory of business, and one is atomistic in its understanding, Newtonian, the shareholder model, and the stakeholder model, of course, is community oriented, process oriented view of business. And that kind of shift can happen, but it's and may indeed happen someday, but it might require some kind of unpleasant event to precipitate that. Or it could
Right.
just simply be a shift in mindset that occurs just through the passing of time.
Something was coming up for me, Bob, and I don't know how to phrase this, but and you can help me if it doesn't land rightly. But if you look at the last few centuries uh, in our civilization, different nations tried to install democracy as a mode of functioning in the civic space or the nation's space, and there are certain key principles around democracy in terms of debate and discourse and a whole lot of ways in which you can use countervailing power to keep power in check in some sense. Uh, and then and in some sense, if I refer to the work of Elizabeth Anderson, if I'm getting the name right, who writes a book called Corporates, who sees corporates as private government, uh, more in terms of, again, the top down, weighing very heavily in terms of privileged class over the unprivileged one, bringing it down. How do you as a thinker look at democracy, and how it's continuously how it's currently unfolding, and does that give you some kind of optimism, or do you still feel uh, there are some tenets of democracy that could be brought into businesses so that some of these countervailing power in check, could be modeled? How do you
Yeah,
think
well,
through this?
100 years ago in the scientific management area, the key words were industrial democracy, and bringing some of the ideas of democracy into a business rather than the top-down kind of authoritarian way of running a business. Democracy is a lot of work. It's negotiation, it's give and take, it's compromise, and so forth. And democracy is distinct from business, which tends to be more top-down to greater or lesser extents. Some leaders are very democratically oriented in how they run the business, but most are less so, and some very much less so. But the political environment seems to me to be running more in the direction of we need, people saying we need to run the country like we run a business, which suggests more of the top down, do it my way, or take the highway, leave, if you don't like it, leave. So currently, I think it's heading in a direction that has more of the coloring of the business metaphysics applied to it than the sort of classic democratic metaphysics.
Great. You must have studied quite a bit of frameworks and models in your span of teaching and writing so many books. You're a prolific author. You've written about 27 books, if I'm not mistaken. Authored and
28,
co-authored.
28, but who's counting? Yeah, right.
Okay. Um, So the question I had was, are there any model? How do you see some of the universals that can be baked into these models, or have you thought through this?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I mean, I believe it has to align with reality, you know, and with lived experiences. And I think this is the big weakness of classical and neoclassical economics. It does not explain reality as well as institutional or evolutionary economics does. But it, you know, the Newtonian atomistic way of thinking is so deeply embedded, and there's so many proponents of that, and to continue that way of thinking, that it fully discourages any kind of advancement into, you know, industrial democracy or systems thinking or the stakeholder model. There's also just the problem of there's so many variables in play that complexity thinking will always be contaminated or colored by atomistic thinking if it remains based on you know, natural language, because our natural language has our metaphysics built into it, whereas mathematical expressions, you know, quantum physics and so forth, you know, that's devoid of the atomistic metaphysics, the Newtonian metaphysics. So if you're dealing with natural language and how people think about this, you know, the model and framework, um, you try to have the universal in it, that it reflects reality and lived experiences. Any framework, I think any framework can produce useful looking results, but how do they stand up to close scrutiny? And I think a lot of times when you're engaged in a team of people problem solving at work, somebody's always in there trying to figure out how to solve the problem in a direction that's going to be the least work for me and the most work for somebody else. So there's a political dimension to it. And so whether they're thinking about the problem in a framework of Cynefin, you've got that going on. You've got other people trying to divert and say, that's not a problem, but here is the problem, you know, so you have this, you know, difficult situation that's occurring in these kinds of dialogues. And then when you extend that to involve documentation of narratives, what people think the problem is, well, then you're really into the, you know, people have that business way of thinking embedded in their head, and that metaphysics and other metaphysics that they pull in, such that these kinds of conversations have some level of, you know, contamination of the atomistic way of thinking, even though the framework might be trying to get you out of that.
Right.
So you're never completely clean. And maybe you don't need to be, you can still get some useful results anyway, but
Right.
you always have that problem.
Right. What, Bob, do you think, what do you think are constituents or elements of a healthy debate or discourse? Let's say you put out this post and the people who are consuming it, and they have maybe something's coming up for them, and some resonate with whole of it or part of it, and some do not, a whole of it or part of it. What would you consider as a slightly better discourse, better way to move this forward?
Yeah, it's not really social media. It's best off to have these kinds of conversations such as we're having. And we didn't establish ground rules for argumentation and, you know, formalize it like that. But we're having, you know, a nice conversation and asking questions and I guess challenging each other in a healthy kind of way. And I think in this type of conversation, we're trying to avoid, you know, traps like illogical thinking and cognitive biases. We're trying to be open-minded and think about how we can improve from where we are to some better place tomorrow or the next day. Not, you know, not in 100 years, but more, you know, maybe in 100 years too. But social media is it's not a good place for this. It's very difficult in short amount of words to talk about this, you cannot see the smile, the facial expression, or their anger, or whatever. So,
Right. Yeah. You've written, we just talked about the number of books that you've written, authored and co-authored. Uh, we're in an age of self-expression like never before. Um,
yeah.
you just talked about social media. Um, how do you see this unfolding? What are some of the things that you find really helpful, and what are the things that you're finding extremely challenging?
Well, personally, I'm driven by curiosity to know why certain problems just exist for a long time. I remember leaving my company after 12 years. I was in industry a total of 15 years, and then going into academia. And I would have students from my old company in there. Um, and so 10 years later, I'm teaching, and I get a student from my company, and they worked in an area that I used to work in, and we talk about what's going on. And the student says, "Oh yeah, we still have those same problems 10 years later." So this kind of thing interests me, that why we have these long lasting problems, and why certain problems are repeated. You have a manager comes in, fix a problem, they're there for 3 years. New manager comes in, creates the old problem again. Why is this stuff happening? Oh, why is to quote Thorsten Veblen, the dead hand of the past? Why are these traditions making it so difficult to make progress in leadership and management thinking and practice? So within that framework, these books reflect a self-expression. Of things that I'm interested in that others, I don't know, I don't necessarily write these books to satisfy an audience. It's more written to satisfy my own interest, and that I believe other people would be interested in knowing about these things as well. The difficulty in all this world of self-expression is gaining an audience for one's work, because there's people have other priorities and distractions and nonsense and all kinds of things that they face every day. So I think the self-expression is good, but it's a very noisy world out there to try to gain an audience. And it's also, you know, part of my work has always been, the theme has been originality. Don't just write about what everybody else is writing about. If there's a popular topic like value stream maps or something, I don't write a Me Too book about that. I'm more inclined to think about that critically and say, how can people improve their practice of that, rather than, and it would be a blog post, it wouldn't be a book or anything like that. So yeah, gaining the audience, originality, and how do people recognize originality? I don't know if you remember, there's a famous violinist called Joshua Bell, who played for an hour or two of violin music that people would pay thousands of dollars to sit in the front row of the concert hall to hear him play. So he's in the train station in Washington, D.C. playing with the violin case open for money and all that, and dressed, like normal,
Ordinary, yeah.
ordinary dress. And the only people who stopped and really listened were people who had some experience playing violin, and who knew how good sounding Joshua Bell was. But nobody recognized him. They'll just walk by him. And so, how do people in this sea of self-expression, how do they recognize originality? How do they recognize talent? I think that's an ongoing problem. And also, to the extent of my work, of where is the criticism of my work? That's one thing I find bizarre, is that I don't receive the type of criticism where somebody said, I read on your book, such and such a page, paragraph, whatever, this, and I'm referencing something else on this page and this thing, and I think you're wrong because of this and that and the other, with counterfactual information documented. And I don't get that. I mean, you just hear people say, I disagree. Okay, be specific about what, and and how do and I don't get that. And I got to be wrong lots of times, but I just don't see it. So that's another weird thing about this era of self-expression.
Maybe we need citation-based criticism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always helpful. I mean, one of the things
Yeah.
that's good, that happens in academic journals is you write a paper, there's a rejoinder or a rebuttal or some kind of, somebody says, I disagree and here's why, and they document the why with the citations and so forth. They have conversations like we're having at scientific conferences, which sometimes get formalized into those rebuttals and so forth. But the business world doesn't operate typically like that. And so it's just kind of people arguing with each other.
Um, what do you, Bob, do for debiasing and staying clear from emotional contagion?
Yeah. Um, I'm constantly doing research. I'm constantly reading. I don't have much interest in writing more books, but I'm still doing research. I'm still reading. I'm constantly synthesizing ideas, thinking about new ideas. I like to learn about both sides of the argument, or all three sides, or whatever. I don't focus on one side of the argument, and that helps immensely with debiasing because there is merit in the other arguments. Sometimes the arguments are very confused, and um, the core parts of the argument do have merit, but then there's a lot of junk around it that's just nonsense. The other thing, so I tend to be very logical and analytical, so that helps with avoiding emotional contagion. Long ago, for debiasing, as well as avoiding emotional, groupthink and emotional contagion, is to elevate my critical thinking skills. Because one of the things I learned through all of my education and my PhD was that the critical thinking skills that I was taught and that I had developed myself were inadequate. They were just not good enough. And what really sent me to a higher level was when I was a participant in Kaizen with a Kaizen consulting company called Shingijutsu. And that really just bumped me up. I look at critical thinking on a logarithmic scale, in which you learn in grade school and high school is a 1, and in a college is a 10, and your master's or PhD is 100. But Shingijutsu took it to 10,000. I mean, it was quite an amazing experience. But I got to say, debiasing and avoiding the groupthink actually upsets a lot of people in the community that I write in. They would much rather that I be biased and with them in the groupthink and emotionally attached as the group is biased, consistent with that group. And that is both remarkable and it's really quite funny, actually.
Right, Bob. Um, the last curiosity that I had was where do you draw your hope and optimism from? Um, yeah.
You've posed a lot of good questions, and I think that this is this is a tough question. I guess I have a lot of curiosity. I look forward to each day of learning something new and hopefully making a small contribution. Um, I think I just have a internal reservoir for this because in doing the research that I do in my daily readings, it could be very easy to say, oh, it's too hard, I give up, it's not worth it. I should just tune everything out, get rid of social media, get rid of the internet, stop watching TV, and just read happy books. But I don't do that. I think I'm just driven to try to make some contributions that reflect my own need to be, my own curiosity and need to learn. And I try to, and I believe that sharing the learning is a good thing to do.
True, true, Bob. Just the last, since you mentioned about that, recently I was listening to an interview of Yuval Harari. You will know Harari, and he was speaking about the current ongoing conflict in Middle East. And I think he referred to the sheer intellectual laziness, which is getting people to jump to conclusions on black and white, right and wrong, taking sides. Um, do you? And I would just park this. And the other thing is, the second bucket is the sheer explosion of what's being published by individuals and institutions is just humongously growing.
Mhm.
Do you think the cognitive labor or the cognitive muscle needs to be exercised even more than before? Or do you think that there are certain first principles that can help you ground this better?
Well, I think one of the things that people need to be educated on, and probably in school and early on, is to be able to separate good information from bad information, and to better understand the difficulty with dichotomies. I mean, dichotomies can be very useful for exploring um, new ground, new territory, and to thinking of things in different ways if you do it scientifically. If you do it casually, like, oh, this group of people is good and that group of people is bad, with just hardly even a surface level understanding of the situation, then that's not a good thing. But that's the lowest cognitive load, to be able to do that. And what we've seen in recent years, recent decades, is the equivalency of facts with opinion, and those are not equivalent. And there's a big cognitive load with having a fact-based um, understanding of things, as opposed to just a casual understanding of things that yields a simple opinion.
Mhm. Right, Bob. In fact, as I go through some of my notes and what we've discussed today, I'm sure there are some things that I may not have covered, or once I go through this and edit and publish it, there might be some more questions come up which I could have, asked in terms of maybe challenging more healthily and some other nuances that we could have captured on the post. Um, Maybe what I could do is after we publish this post, we'll see how it turns out. We may, I'll seek again your convenience and see if we can do a follow up
Sure.
and if that's possible.
Yep, absolutely. I'd look
Yeah,
forward to it. It's been a
yeah.
great conversation. Thank you so much.